We're whalers on the moon.
We carry a harpoon.
But there ain't no whales, so we tell tall tales and sing a whaling tune.
Hi, I'm Luke Hector and this is The Broken Meeple, a show where I devote my time to raving and ranting about board games, but usually more the ranting part. And the award for the most buzzed about game of this year goes to Shackleton Base. Jesus Christ. This one is constantly talked about. I am seeing review scores of like 4.5 out of 5s, I've seen 9 out of 10s, 10 out of 10s. Everybody is going absolutely nuts crazy about this game. Now, when I actually tried to play it at Essen, I couldn't. I stood at a table waiting for a demo for 45 minutes, only to then be told after the game finished that it was a bookable system. And yet they didn't make it clear that it was a bookable system. Slightly miffed by that, but oh well, it just meant I had to be patient to get the game when it released on retail back in like November time. So this is not a review copy, this is me going out of my way to grab this, because I just had to find out what was going on with this. Designed by Fabio Lopiano and Nestor Mangone, I have no idea if I pronounced those correctly, but basically these two designers have made a bit of a name themselves with mid-weight Euro games. They've got a bit of a popularity going with them. Can't say I've followed too many of their previous games, but there are some that I've come across and gone, this is pretty good. But this one is essentially a midweight Euro where you're placing astronauts on the moon to do different actions, but its main sort of selling point is the idea that you've got these corporations where you mix in 3 out of, I think, 7 or 8 different potentials into the game, and they change up the way that you will try and score points. You know, you have to focus on all 3 to some extent. You know, you might be able to ignore 1 and focus on just 2, but the idea is that these will change up the way the game system flows. Now, it's a tall order to do something like that. That is not an easy thing to do in a game, but I just had to jump into this. And every time I looked at this at Essen on the table or when people were playing it, 2 things kind of stuck out to me. One, it looks pretty bland. Like, it's not a particular looker on the table. We'll get onto that later. But also, I just couldn't quite tell where things were going for what reason. Like, the graphic design was done in such a way that I couldn't see how things were flowing together. It just looked a bit confusing to me at first. But you know, gotta dive in. So I dived in completely blind as to how it played or anything like that, and just thought, let's find out the truth. Let's find out if this is really as amazing as people are saying, or whether this is another one of those titles where the buzz is high, but the result is not quite there.
Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen.
In Shackleton Base, your goal is obviously to get the most victory points.
Of course!
And to do this, you need to satisfy the needs of 3 corporations. There are 7 in the game, and 3 will get picked out at random. Each one has their own rules reference sheet, each one has their own components, each one has their own kind of mini-game mechanic that you satisfy in order to score points. Each one can also have cards that are associated with it that give you little special bonuses and endgame scoring opportunities. But the main premise is the use of these astronauts. So you have 3 different colours, you got blue, yellow, and red. Each one kind of gives you some other sort of different bonus or some different ability to trigger. In the first part of each round, you have a shuttle phase where players will choose and draft from these shuttles. These give you some starting little resources, they give you a turn order sequence, but also dictate which astronauts you're going to get for the round. So if I pick this one, for example, I get this collection of astronauts, and these are my 6 actions for the turn. You only get 18 actions in the game. It's quite tight in that respect. And then during the main phase, you are essentially placing them primarily on this command track down here to trigger specific actions, like building bases on the moon, like buying particular project cards for those 3 corporations I mentioned, or triggering what is called kind of like a corporation action, which each of the different boards has their own specific corporation action, but it also revolves around this reputation track where the higher you are, the more bonuses you can get. That's kind of like the main thing you'll do. You are able to switch up your astronauts for different ones via the lunar gateway, so you can kind of exchange one for a different color and get some money if you're really strapped for, I kind of really need a red one right now. There's a red one there, I don't have a red one here, fine, I'll do an exchange. Quite useful. But then also you can place your astronauts around the side of the moon and trigger the line in which to get different bonuses. So you can get money, you can get corporation actions, you can trigger the different tokens that are on the board, but this is done by way of an area majority system. So you might build a base, say, in this region here, it's worth 3, I might build another one here, it's worth 2. And the idea is that when you trigger a particular row, you look at the sections where you've got a building and it will give you the reward based on that. However, if other players have majority in certain sections and you're not present, you may have to give them money or pay more money in order to actually trigger that entire line. So there is a pseudo area majority feel to this game, but it's not quite the same as like, oh, I've blocked you out of an action. It's just you might make the action a little bit more expensive by being there. The astronauts, as I said, play a key part in the actions you do. If I use yellow on the command action, then this allows me to build a lot of structures from on my board. And these structures have different during the game and end game rewards, depending on which I build. If I build some of my little 2-person hubs here, and then slot some astronauts of the right colors in them, they give me abilities and like discounts throughout the game. But then if I use the free hub, for example, and put them out and slot different astronauts in them, I can get like instant money, but also some endgame scoring, and build your big hub, and you really want to get your reputation up because that can score you mega points if you build your giant hub. It's kind of like how the board in Terra Mystica works, where you can build different levels of buildings, and it's like, do I want to build a big hub or do I leave it till later? Now, the idea with the red ones is that they allow you to get different cards. So as I mentioned, these different corps, they've got their own components, but they've also got their own cards, their own little project cards, unique to that corporation. Each one has a cost and requirement, usually comprising of money and energy, which is another resource you're going to manage. But these give you special bonuses, special endgame scoring opportunities, or in the case of Artemis Tours here, give you a way to slot these astronauts onto the cards in order to score points and get bonuses. It's quite a nifty little mechanic. And then finally, you got the blue kind of utilitarian astronauts, I like to call them. These ones go on here and they mainly generate corporation actions. What those actions are depends entirely on which corporations you're using. I mean, if I use it with, say, the Selenium Research one, I can pay certain resources I've got during the game and get a tile that gives me some extra bonus and points. Okay, cool. But then if you use it with Artemis Tours, and you get to collect these astronauts and you get to slot them onto cards. It entirely depends on what the corp does. Alternatively, you can simply just gain bonuses from the reputation track, which is a sort of high risk but high cost thing. You know, it gives, well, no, sorry, high reward, high cost. You can get a lot of bonuses from this track and get a lot of nice stuff and points. But when you get to the end of the round, you have to pay maintenance costs for everything you've built and everything on the reputation track, and this can add up to quite a lot of money if you're not careful. After the astronauts have been placed, you have, as I said, the maintenance phase where you will pay costs based on where you are on a reputation track and what you've built. You'll also collect your income from various buildings and cards that you have made, so anything with the universal hand of giving, as I call it, for the universal Euro icon gives you income. But then also you get to retrieve astronauts from the board and potentially place them in the slots on your board that you've opened up in order to get those discounts or bonuses, as I mentioned. You then rinse and repeat this for another 2 rounds. You do 18 actions throughout the whole game, 6 astronauts in each round, and of course, once you get to the end, after you've totaled up the endgame scoring points, what do you think? So we'll start with the way that this game is packaged. Now, I do not think this game is a looker. I would say from an artwork perspective, this is a very bland looking game. It is one big collage of grey with some icons dotted around, not a lot of colour. In fact, the main use of colour is the astronauts. Other than that, you don't have a huge amount of it. And it's not really going to turn heads when somebody passes by. That being said, as a storage solution, top marks. This is really cool.
We just make boxes here.
You know, yes, the production quality is a little bit on the cheap side. You know, these astronauts are probably the best component in the game, but everything else is kind of standard cardboard, not particularly interesting. Even these player boards are these foldable ones, so they're kind of like the fake foldable ones, but you don't actually stick them down. They don't provide any adhesive for you to stick the board down, so you just basically have this loose thing that you, like, just leave it as it is. It's kind of weird. I mean, I guess I don't need it to be stuck down, but it is another way of cutting costs. But you do get a lot of other stuff in here. I mean, all the corporations have got their own player board, so each of these has got their own sort of detailed layout for how they work. You've got reference aids for each of the corporations themselves, but kudos has to be given to this tuck box system. This is how I want more games to start being packaged. You know, Tim Eisner from Weird City Games makes a big deal of this in a lot of his games. Well, here it works just the same because it makes setup easier. Now, I'm not going to say that, well, we'll get on to setup a bit later, but having a box for all your astronauts, having a box for all your shuttle stuff in it, all these primary components are well and good, but the corporations are nicely in their own little box. So if I want to select 3 at random, all I've got to do is just sort of, without looking, just pick 3 out of the tuck boxes. So this time I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. Here we go. Skywatch, Selenium Research, and Evergreen Farms. All the components are in here. I can then put the rest in the box and ignore them. It's just a very nice, neat, clean system.
A cookie!
No, it's not a cookie!
Not the cookie.
And while we're on the subject of these corps, this does add a nice amount of replay value to the game. Now, don't get me wrong, these corporations do not fundamentally change the game. The core of the game with placing the astronauts, using the area majority row system for income and the corporation actions and such, that remains the same no matter what. These corporations do not suddenly change the game from being a resource management game to a deck building game to a bag building game like such. It's not like, right, Evergreen Farms is area majority and Selenium Research is bag building and Skywatch is deck building. That's not how it works. They're just subtle little differences, mainly again revolved around resource management. It's just changing kind of what the resource is and what it does when you get it. Now, even with that aside, that still adds a decent amount of replay value because you will have some different games from time to time, based on which ones you pick, but just don't get into this idea that, the game is going to be fundamentally different, or you're going to have, like, memorable experiences, or like, oh yeah, do you remember that game where I used space robotics, Evergreen and Selenium? Do you remember that weird combination of what that did? No, it's not quite as impactful as that. It's just little subtle changes that, do add up and make for, if you didn't have these corps, this game would be a pretty bare bones affair and not have much to sell itself for. These really do kind of make the game. This is Shackleton base. It is all about these corps. Now, they do range in difficulty. They have reference aids to help you, and so you've got, like, details for all the cards on them, you've got the rules for setup and solo integrate and stuff like that, and it's like, these are cool. I'm glad that they did this. Although, the complexity rating does need to be bear in mind, because they give you 3 to use for the first game, like the complexity ones. Skywatch and Tomar's Heroes, complexity 3 and 4, and woo-wee, yeah. You're going to need to be careful with some of these. Some of these are very easy to integrate. Some of these are a little bit more on a fiddly side, to the extent where when you look at how much you're going to play these modules, you're probably going to play 3 or 4 of these modules 90% of the time, and then the rest once in a blue moon, unless everybody knows the game inside out. I wouldn't recommend any of the high complexity ones for new players. It will just completely overwhelm them.
There'll be plenty of time to discuss your objections when and if you return.
As a midweight Euro game, the rules overhead is not as high as I would expect for a lot of other games, but by no means perfect. We'll get onto the flaws a little bit later, but generally there's not a huge amount of rules to teach at the start of the game, other than having to add those corporation actions on, like I mentioned before. But if you stick to some of the low complexity ones, it won't take you that long to get those bits across, and they all kind of share the same graphic design and the same kind of rule set for corporation actions, so they do blend together a little bit. But yeah, you're not going to be sat there for a huge, humongous teach like you would say, Art Nova or Hegemony, or, like, a really big Euro game. This is definitely more in the mid-weight category, which does allow you to get going quicker. The game boasts a pretty impressive time length. I mean, it says 60 to 120 minutes, which sounds amazing on paper, and yeah, for the most part, you should be able to keep to that 120 minutes timeline. You're talking 2.5 hours for, like, a first game, teaching, AP players, 4 players, that kind of thing. But yeah, 2 hours is reasonable that you should be able to achieve after a couple of games, or maybe with 3 players only. 60 minutes is a bit of a pipe dream. I'm sorry, I would love to see a 2-player game of this or a solo game of this finish in 60 minutes. It is not going to happen. I mean, solo, the setup for this game is a bit of a chore. In multiplayer, it's not so bad. You can kind of give a corp to a player with the reference sheet and say, just follow the directions and set up the corp. That speeds the setup from that respect. But man, you try and do the setup yourself with 3 different corps, having to remind yourself what the rules for the corps are, and get all the pieces out, and the AI board, and all that stuff. God blimey, yeah, you are not doing that in anything less than 15 minutes, 20 minutes maybe, and then you think you're going to play the rest of the game in 40 minutes, or even 60 minutes at all? God blimey, yeah, no solo game has ever taken 60 minutes. No 2-player game is going to take 60 minutes. It's just not physically possible. But, 90 to 120 is achievable. 2.5 hours is probably a bit more realistic for most gaming groups with new players, etc. But it doesn't feel like it outstays its welcome. I think it does as much as it needs to in the time length given. Maybe 2.5 hours is a little bit long, but again, you shouldn't be in that bracket that often. And maybe just for your first couple of games, you should be able to get it closer to 2 hours. And at that length, particularly with 4 players, I think that's a good length for what is offered here. And the meat from this game is essentially in that resource mechanic and the utilization of the 3 different colors of astronauts. The free actions themselves don't feel useless, although you are mainly going to be doing the command action for 75% of the time. Occasionally you'll need to jump on an income track, and occasionally you might go to the Lunar Gateway. They're by no means useless actions, but they're just not as necessary as the command one. Plus the command one gets more expensive the longer the round goes on, so you're going to want to get in there early ideally. But this is definitely quite a tight game for resources. You know, there are times where somebody might have quite a lot of money depending if they've managed to do a good combo. But yeah, with the metals and the rare ore and the energy and stuff like that, there's a lot of planning required, a lot of timing aspects, and you know, you're definitely going to have to plan ahead with these colors of astronauts. I mean, if I get a shuttle that gives me a bunch of the yellows, well, okay, so I can do a lot of building this round, but do I want to do a lot of building? And if I am going to, that means I'm going to need a lot of minerals. Where am I going to get them? I kind of maybe need to generate some income first. Maybe, you know what, I don't want this many yellows. I'm going to swap this for a red in the Lunar Gateway. Now I can get some cards I really want. There's a lot of decent things that you have to think about, which aren't like overly complicated to get in your mind, but the real crux of this is how to get from A to B. It's never as obvious as you think, because you've got the different ways that you can get income from here. You have got the different corporation bonuses and various things on those, you know, these different boards and that, where you can gain more resources. And then of course you've got just simply slotting astronauts onto your board could discount your maintenance phase. It could make it cheaper to get cards. It could make it cheaper to, you know, build buildings, etc. So there's a lot of different things that can link together nicely to get you to where you need to go, and it's not always obvious how to do it. It's definitely a more thinky Euro in the midweight category. It doesn't quite reach heavyweight, but yeah, I would be reluctant to put anybody who was not used to, you know, tight Euros into this one. Now, that does carry a little bit of a flaw, that this game does get you into situations now and again where you feel kind of useless. You know, you want to do this, but you don't have any money. But you don't have the astronauts or the facility to get a lot of money. And if you do, it's not going to be a lot and not enough for what you really want to do. So with only 18 actions in the game, especially as the actions get more and more expensive, I mean, with another player, they could literally just fill up the row that you really wanted to do, and suddenly the action is too expensive for you to do, which completely neuters your ability to do that action for this round. It's a little bit annoying when that happens, and I've seen it happen to a fair amount of players. This is not an uncommon situation. You know, we're not talking the likes of Cooper Island here in terms of, oh my god, I'm punished, there's no way I'm going to win this. But certainly, yeah, there are going to be times where, you know, somebody making an action that little bit more expensive, or, you know, somebody building a spot on the map nearby you is just going to make life that little bit harder and possibly take you out of the action that you want to do, and you might sometimes feel that you can't recover.
Stop whining.
Now, I mentioned this isn't the best looking game in the world. Fair enough, we'll gloss over that bit for the most part. The graphic design is decent, but not always present where you want it. Certain actions, like the income action and the Lunar Gateway action, are nicely labeled where you can remember how they work, probably without needing to look at the rulebook too much for them, or perhaps not entirely. But then the iconography for the command action is pretty much non-existent. Yeah, you know that yellow is build and it gets to trigger tokens afterwards. That's about it. But that's not the whole action. The action has a lot more nuances to it. And even though I said that there's not a huge amount of initial overhead, you do still have the slight problem that you've got 3 corporations that are different every game, that you have to understand how they work, how they set up, and how, you know, how they function in terms of points. This is additional rules that you've got to deal with, and if you use more of the complex cores, this does add a little bit to the setup and the complexity of the game. But also the rulebook is fine. The rulebook's got a decent amount of pictorial examples, and it does rinse and repeat a few things now and again, and it's laid out okay from the initial learning. What I do find is problematic with this one, though, is when somebody asks an FAQ question, because this game does have a lot of niche rules hidden within rules. Yeah, you get to build something off your board. There's the cost. there's a little bit more to it than that. There's usually, well, hang on, what if somebody's there and somebody's there? Or what if I've got this and not that? Or what if the energy's at this level? Wait, do I get reputation points when I go up one spot or for the whole lot? You know, there's a lot of things where the FAQ makes this a little bit hard to reference. And so, you know, as much as the initial overhead is not that bad, if you're learning this game for the first time, or somebody's not teaching it that well, you could find a lot of questions being asked and not a lot of easy ways to be able to answer them. And this is compounded by the fact that as much as you do have these cool reference aids for each corporation, I mean, kudos that you have these, this is great, having to constantly pass these things around the board when people need to know how they work is a little bit annoying, but it also means that there's no player reference aids for the player.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Seriously? You have a game where there's multiple different corps, you have a game where there's actions not entirely laid out on the board, you have rules within niche rules, and you don't give players a reference aid of any kind?
That is why you fail.
Seriously, that could have been a really easy thing for you to do, and it would have made a lot of things a lot better. You maybe don't even need a reference card to do the Lunar Gateway and the income action because they're pretty well done, but okay, you could have a reference card that does it and it would take minimal space. But seriously, if you're willing to print out entire A4 sheets for one particular corporation, would it have really hurt you to do a card maybe about this size that just basically lists out step by step how all the different command actions works, particularly building, because I think the building action does get quite fiddly in places about how it works and the nuances and FAQ moments. That's definitely the most fiddly action in this game by far, as well as also explaining maybe a little bit more about the graphic design on your board for how the buildings score you points and bonuses, because these are not particularly clear in some respects. Some of them are more obvious than others, but you know, I do sometimes forget what these free infrastructures are meant to do instantly and what they're meant to do later. It's a little bit on the like, how does this work now? So, you know, just a little bit of a nice fix would have made the game a lot smoother.
We're sorry.
Player interaction in this game is kind of bare bones as well. The main two things that players will do to infuriate you is one of twofold. Firstly, this command track here. When players place astronauts on here, it progressively makes the action more and more expensive. Now you have some idea of how that's going to play out based on the shuttles that players take, but given that you can exchange astronauts at the Lunar Gateway, that's not always as apparent as you might think. But this is kind of like a one thing that players might do to get in your way. They're not necessarily doing it to screw you over, it's just the fact that they need to do it as cheap as they can. It just happens to be the one thing that you want to do. The other thing is the area majority on here, but it's not really as involved as you might think. People aren't really blocking you to an extent. Yes, they might go to a hex, put their 2 building down, and it's like, oh, I fancy going there. Oh, well, you could always just go somewhere else. I mean, there's plenty of decent spots for you to go. But the main aspect of this is just simply that if I put my astronaut on here and pay a credit, I might have to pay an additional credit to do a hex on this line when I didn't have to. But again, it's annoying, but it's not quite as much player interaction as I maybe would have liked. You know, and you don't know when somebody's going to trigger a particular line or when somebody might build and where exactly they're going to build. You know, it's not something you can really plan out. It just kind of happens. So there is a little interaction, but not a ton.
Hooray! People are paying attention to me!
This also causes a bit of a problem with the player scaling aspect, because yes, this command board scales with players, so at least you have the right amount for astronauts over here, but in terms of the map, it doesn't scale at all. They don't take out hexes, they don't block off areas or anything, which is kind of a bit of a misstep, because if you play this 1 or 2 player, this map is kind of inconsequential. You know, you'll build a few things, you can get some income, you can get some tokens, but what the opponent does is not that interesting. And frankly, if they build in a hex over there, you could just go in one of a million directions and just go away from them if you really want to. You know, you practically don't need to see each other. You could at the start of the game go, right, you have this half of the moon and I'll take this half of the moon. Okay, cool. And then you would never see each other again. It's just not that interesting. 3 players is not bad, but really, I actually for once think you actually need the full count of 4 players to get the most out of this map mechanic. But then that, of course, means you're taking the game to probably a 2.5 hour length, 2 hours at best. You're going to have more AP and downtime, because obviously this game can generate a lot of analysis paralysis with the different options, or you could be sat there waiting for a while for someone to take their turn. It's just, there's no real player count that I think is like the chosen bit. Maybe 3 is the best, but Even at 3, you know, the map can be contested, it might not be. I still think you probably need the full count of 4. You just have to accept it's a longer affair.
I don't think any of us expected him to say that.
The game doesn't have a runaway leader problem per se, but you do sometimes find in some games you can call the winner pretty early. This is an engine building game as well as resource management, so you know, I'm doing things to get points and I might have just found a combo of corps and cards that's really giving me good stuff. Well, by the point you get halfway through the game, you should realize that somebody has built something that is just working, and all they gotta do is just keep rinsing and repeating it and mutinizing it to its max, and they will score a bucket load of points. Somebody who has started off bad in round 1 is unlikely to claw their way back in round 2 and 3. There just simply isn't enough actions to do so, and so especially in a 4-player game, you find yourself in a situation where, right, we played this for half the game length, things haven't gone well for me, I don't think I'm scoring many points, you're doing pretty well, yeah, you're going to win, I'm going to come 3rd or 4th, and then lo and behold, that exact prediction comes true, which does kind of make the second half of the game a little bit anticlimactic. You know, the points have never been tight. You know, the point markers go up to stupid levels. I mean, this thing laps to 50 points, and yet your markers go to 200. I'm not even sure it's physically possible to get over 150, let alone 250. What the hell? But, you know, maybe you could do over 150 if you do blindingly well, but Jesus Christ, 200? 250? How the hell do you score that many points in this game? You know, did the other players have to be literally tied to the chair, deaf, dumb, and blind for this to happen? It's like, no way. I've never had a game where somebody has had like, right, I've got 190 points and you're just ahead of me with 191. I couldn't have called that. Nah, you can call the leader and the victor pretty easily by the time you're at least halfway, 2/3 of the way, and at that point, you're just kind of going through the motions. The game does come with a solo mode, although we are going to talk about good and bad here. I mean, from a good perspective, it's relatively easy to pilot. All you've got is a small deck of cards, you flip one over, match it with the one before, and essentially you check which letters are the same or which one are highlighted, then go top, middle, or bottom with the astronauts that the AI's got left, and perform that action with that respective corporation. Not very difficult at all, really. And because you are using the different corps each game, the solo cards for each of the corps are integrated nicely, and you simply just go, right, Moon Mining A, Selenium Research B, Artemis Taurus C, and there you go, and this is how the AI is going to score points. It's smooth to operate in a decent system, to the fact where you actually might consider whether this is better than multiplayer. Certainly in terms of interaction, we'll get onto that a bit later. But there are some negatives. Firstly, you know, the graphic design on some of these like cards is not the most intuitive ever. Like, I swear I still don't quite get how the moon mining one's meant to work. But it's also quite a cheaty AI. It doesn't use resources, and there are times where it seems to do an action and go, yeah, that got me a point. That didn't seem like that worth an action. And then there'll be another time where it does something and just goes, oh yeah, I get 1,000,000 points because I can get all the Artemis astronauts in the world for no effort compared to you who has to jump through 1,000,000 hoops to do so. It's like, it feels a little bit frustrating when an AI just cheats its way to 1,000,000 points. But it also does make the points for the AI a little bit erratic. You know, I would say that you should win this on easy, but if you play this on higher difficulties, that swinginess is going to make it anywhere between, you know, a cakewalk to insanely impossible to beat it, depending on what corpse you've got. But also, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the board is not that interesting when you have less players. You know, 1 or 2 players does not generate enough congestion on this board. If the AI builds in certain areas, you just simply go off elsewhere. You don't really need to be in each other's faces that much. And if the AI is focusing on a particular corp, I mean, it will try to spread itself out, but for example, I had one game where it focused pretty heavily in Artemis Taurus. Okay, fine. I just went and did Selenium Research instead. Yeah, do what you like with the tours. I don't really care. I'm not going to try and stop you. You just do your thing and I'll just do my thing over here. Doesn't feel like you're really battling the AI as much as simply trying to score more points than it does by way of its cheaty system. And if you're going to do an AI like that, you might as well just simply go, right, I'm playing this on normal difficulty, I must beat a threshold of 150 points. Okay, go. And then you don't have to do any piloting of the AI, because that's about as much interaction as you have with it during the game.
Well, that's a lot less hot.
Shackleton Base is one of the most buzzed about games I've heard about this year. Man, you try and find a board game critic that will say anything bad about this game, it's not a common thing. Although you know what I'm like. But, you know, you talk to players who play this, and again, a lot of people like this, but some people do go, it's fine. You know, not that massive a fan, but, you know, it's decent. And there's a lot of good stuff the game has. I particularly like the variation with the corpse. I think this is a neat idea. I love that it's in tuck boxes, and it does add a little bit of replay value to the game, but what you need to understand is that these do not fundamentally change the game, okay? They just simply add a little mini mechanic for scoring points, which again, yes, is variety, and you have 7 of them. You only pick 3 of them, so there's a lot of different combinations there. But it's not like you're going to make this game drastically different from one to the next, because you are still utilizing the same system with the resources, the astronauts, and your player board. But it is still cool. You know, it's not that long of a game. It's not too much of a rules overhead, although the rules do kind of need a little bit of work. I think the rulebook could have been improved in terms of referencing niche rules. The lack of a player aid for the basic actions I think is kind of unforgivable. I mean, seriously, you've got a game with interchangeable corps, and I do appreciate that you give a reference aid at massive proportions for each corp, but would it have killed you to done some player aids for players? That would have been nice, especially as the graphic design is fine, but a little bit lacking in certain areas, particularly with the command action where it's pretty much non-existent. There's just little things that kind of trip it up here and there. There's not a ton of player interaction. People get in your way and make things a little bit more expensive, but it's mainly just by cause and effect rather than somebody actually actively trying to screw you over. And with the player scaling, you've got the issue that the map becomes inconsequential at 1 to 2 players, is kind of there at 3, and only really functions at its best in 4, which then means more AP, more downtime, more time length. So with more players carries that caveat. The solo mode is pretty decent, but again, you have the inconsequential map, but you know, the smoothness of how it operates does mean sometimes you might want to play it solo rather than multiplayer. There's little bits here and there that I do quite like, but there's a few areas where it does trip up and kind of take it out of that region where I'm not quite understanding where people are coming from with this whole, it's the game of the year, absolutely fantastic, 9, 10 out of 10s. I don't quite see that. But I do see how you can enjoy this game and have good fun with it. So if people are giving this seals, you know, saying, oh yeah, this is at least a 7, 8 out of 10 for me. I think this is a good game, a great game, maybe a top 10 of the year for them. I could see that happening. For me, it doesn't quite meet that. But I still think it's decent. I would not want to own this game. I'm probably going to sell this one on. I probably wouldn't suggest this one for a game night. But if you put it on the table and said, I fancy playing some Shackleton base, I'd play it. Yeah, and I'd get some enjoyment out of it. This one for me gets a decent, high, so close but yet so far, 6 out of 10 for above average. It's decent. It's a fine game. I get enjoyment out of it. I like some aspects of it, but I think that maybe just with a little bit more development in certain areas, they could have made this just that little bit smoother, that little bit more like interactive, or just made the player scaling a bit more meaningful. I mean, in 2024, nearly 2025, we should not be making errors on player scaling to this extent. This is something that should have been ironed out a long time ago. But I respect the storage system, I respect the variety it does have, and I respect what it's trying to do to make it a little bit different from other Euro games. You know, this is not quite the most innovative game ever, but, you know, I would like to see more games utilize stuff like this. I mean, a game called Sierra West came out a while ago, and that was a bit more fiddly and a bit more complicated to introduce the different rule sets you could have with that one. This one is a bit easier, so it does that one and improves on that. But yeah, it's a decent 6 out of 10. With a little bit more refinement in some areas, I could have probably given this a 7 out of 10 and given it a seal of endorsement. As it is, it kind of falls a little bit shy. Not likely to be a top 10 of the year for me, and certainly I'm not getting 9 or 10 out of 10 vibes here. I could see people saying that this is 7 or 8 out of 10, I'd be totally cool. But 9 and 10, I think you're being a little bit forgiving. So, Shackleton base, it's decent, but not quite game of the year.
You're going to burn in a very special level of hell.
So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube and thumb it up on Board Game Geek when it goes live on the page. You know, this all sharing and engagement, it's what keeps this channel alive. Check out the Patreon if you want to donate even just $1 a month to keep this channel going. The costs for running this channel have increased. You know, they keep increasing year on year, and I need to keep it running because it is just a hobby, it's not my job. And so it's only with the support of you guys that this channel is able to keep producing the content that it does. Bearing in mind I have to do this in my spare time. Of course, check out the rest of the SN content I've done and let me know your comments about this game. You know, if you love the game, then fair enough. enough, but by all means, let me know in the comments why you love it as much as 9, 10 out of 10s. If you're one of the few people out there that actually does not like this game, I'd be interested to know why you don't like this game, because I feel like there's not enough of you on the internet talking about it in that way. You know, I mean, the internet does hate on people for talking negatively about a game, but I want to hear both sides of the coin. You know, do you like it? And also let me know which corp combinations you like more. You know, out of the 7 corps, 3 that just made the game for you. Why did those 3 make the game for you? Be interested to know. So until next time, remember, regardless of which corporation you represent, it's still only a game, so bye for now.